So that's what we are talking about. And this is where we started because Ian mentioned this last time, triple block. Just a reminder of the size that 1160, not 1164, sorry, 1160 is. And the reason I selected this scale is because I could produce a working block, that is a block that you could line through. Anything smaller than this, and I'm out of luck. So this is the scale I chose. This is where we were with my last presentation. I had finished carving and assembling the stern facade, including the transom and the lights. This is the same when it is finished and now on the boat, on the ship. The two lights on the outside, of course, were blanked out with wood, so that the captain or whomever could have privacy in the privy. We've added the lights with boxwood mullions and pearwood frames. No reason for that, just my choice for aesthetic reasons. And you can begin to see the ebony frame around the facade, the two davits, and the boom rest up at the top. It's a little bit dark in the background, but that's what's there. And same place, but a little better picture of some of the details. We'll come to that in just a moment. Finished the rudder and the rudder coat, which I like to do on my models. Some people don't. That's just a bit of air dry clay that's overlaid with some, I don't even remember what I used, but there's a matte medium or something of that, and then painted with a mask coat. The straps are all paper, actually. At this scale, that's about all that will work. Now we're moving to the details of the quarter galleries, and I'll show you some of the details here, but this is an overview of the port side. The Egyptian was launched in 1799. As I mentioned last time, this was right after Napoleon's allegedly successful attacks and combat in Egypt. And of course, the ship bears the name. And so one had to decorate it in tribute to that adventure. And so what we have here is a French cockerel attacking Egyptian crocodiles, or at least as crocodiles were conceived of as at the time by the designer of this thing. And he did a pretty good job with the cockerel. I'm not so sure about the crocodiles, but that's the way it looked. And above that, some floral decoration that continue the design of the stern. Moving up to the false lights on the sides, the upper center windows frames were hinged inward to provide some ventilation. I haven't attempted to do that. But this was an interesting little piece of work. I started with two pieces of boxwood, and I showed this because I really love the look of boxwood. It's just a beautiful, beautiful wood. And unfortunately, I have to cover it up with the mullions, but this is where we started, fitted to the area. And then added the mullions and dividers. And again, this is boxwood. And one of the great virtues of good quality boxwood is that you can cut fairly thin strips out of it, and it maintains its integrity and allows you to do these things, as well as the lights on the stern that I showed you earlier. final piece of the puzzle is you add decorations. These are pieces of boxwood cut with, well, various tools to cut them, but then glued on. And that's the end of the false lights. We moved up to the shingled roof, which is an interesting sort of design, a kind of a mansard roof on top of this thing. Not that usual to have shingles on these things. There were some others that had them. These had to be cut individually because of the odd shape of this. So one of my favorite tools is Dockyard. We've talked about that before. Dockyard makes really wonderful chisels and gouges, and this is a 1.5 millimeter gouge, which I use to make the shingles out of thin pieces of boxwood stock. Then a kind of unusual feature of this ship was they chose to do a little decoration on the inside of the taffrail or stern facade, which would, I think, not be visible to anybody but a crew working on it. But they chose to do it, and so I did it. And that leads me to a little comment on carving. I do most of my carving with a number 11 blade and some other tools. But what I've learned, and again, this applies mostly to very small scale ships, is the best way to do it is to take a thick, in this case, relatively thick, probably a 16th of an inch, thick piece of boxwood, rather than trying to carve into a thin piece. This gives lower support to whatever you're carving and prevents it from splitting under the pressure of a knife or a gouge. Then once that's done, I turn it upside down and back sand it down to the thickness that I need. And so this is about the right thickness. It's still kind of crude, as you can see, but then at this point, it's not hard to use a knife or a file to finish it out. But again, starting with a thicker piece keeps this thing intact. Then, having finished the stern portion, I did it before I finished the stern portion, but for this presentation, we will move to the bow. And here I have added the cat heads. And you can also see the wonderful stools that the heads that comprise the heads. And at the bow, we have a forward fife rail. Built this obviously off the model. It has a number of sheaves cut into it, and some hooks as well. And here it is installed at the bow. Okay, so at this point, I decided to take a break from working on the hull and the exterior, and a little bit of diversion, and moved to some guns. The Egyptian was interesting in that it carried 4 bronze sea howitzers, most unusual for a ship of this type and size. And they might have carried carronades, but in this case, sea howitzers, which is a ballistic weapon that would be very difficult to deploy against an opposing ship. Because this was in Mediterranean service, it might have been used against shore facilities, but we don't know. So here are the 4 bronze sea howitzers. These fired 36-pounder, nominally 36-pounder shells. That is, they're sized for a 36-pounder. In fact, what it fired was a hollow shell, a hollow ball filled with gunpowder. and a fuse that you would light before you fired the thing. A very dangerous sort of way to go, but that's the way it was done. And I observed that later on, Artillery Lieutenant Shrapnel of the British service decided that you should add iron balls to the gunpowder mix inside these things, and hence the name shrapnel handed down. So this is what they look like. It had a screw lift and a slide carriage, very much the same as a carronade, but again, as intended as a ballistic weapon rather than a point-to-point weapon. So the barrels of these things are turned fairly straightforward. Now, I have a Sherline lathe. Any small lathe really works pretty well with these, but I basically turn the barrel as you see, and then the aft portion flattened down with a file to set it as it was. And these are the boxwood slides, the lower piece of the slides, cut and assembled. Pretty straightforward. And the bolsters of these things I did make out of brass. They're a bit tricky and quite small, but the barrel pivoted on pins in the bolsters, so that's how it was done. And so here's one of the final ones mounted on a Euro, just as a scale reference. Okay, so that was my adventure in armament, and I have put those aside. Those will eventually, when I get back to the interior, be deployed on the quarter and foredecks. There were two at each of those positions. And then back to the hull. So the next step is dead eyes. And this gets tricky at this scale. I've done it before on another model and sort of developed the way that it works for me. One of the problems in making small dead eyes for me is I want them black. And normally I prefer to use ebony for any black elements, but ebony doesn't really work very well for parts that are this small. As you start to drill them and shape them, it tends to be very brittle, and either it's going to, or the drill bit you're using is going to split or break. And so what I learned, and I could go to boxwood, but that would have to be painted. And so once I figured that out, I decided to go with styrene plastic, as it is much easier to drill. You got to paint it anyhow. And since Ian and Paul have shown us that you can make ships out of paper, I guess I figured I could make dead eyes out of plastic. And so here we are. Three different sizes of dead eye. Shows a bit of the process, which is, again, styrene in the middle that's drilled. The one on the right hasn't been shaped yet. It has to be curved more than it is there. And the surround, because I am not fully rigging the Egyptian, I'm only doing lower dead eyes. So lower dead eyes, of course, had metal strapping. And so what I'm using here is copper, a fairly malleable copper wire that I've soldered. Side note here, my favorite, I don't know if everyone is, or anyone is familiar with TIX products, but TIX, T-I-X, solder and flux is a very low temperature solder that is extremely useful for purposes that don't involve stress or pulling on the part. So if there's no stress, a low temperature solder works really well. And the other virtue of this is you can do it with a butane torch, which is a kitchen torch, basically. And that allows you to solder without actually physically touching the part, except with a flame, which for very, very small pieces, and I think I've used it in 1/48 as well, any small metal piece that isn't subject to stress or strain, to me, this is the way to go. Using a soldering iron is tricky when you're dealing with small parts. So that's just my pitch for ticks. And in making these, I created a frame that would hold the piece of plastic. And I use my favorite tool for everything is a pin chucked in a handle of some kind. And so I just poke at it with the tip of the pin that aligns the prospective holes. We drill. And again, the virtue of styrene for this particular use is, as you can see, the drill bit is very, very small. I don't remember what size I used, but I think it's about 0.008, 8/1000ths of an inch, and they're very delicate. So you need to not only drill carefully, but have a material that isn't going to cause it to snap. So here are the dead eyes of various sizes installed in, this is the main, looks like the port side main channel. And you can see on the left as well, one of the triple blocks. And an odd, interesting piece on the right, if you can barely see it, but there's a metal bracket above the gun port on the right-hand side. And that also serves, I don't remember as I'm sitting here now, which line that holds, but it holds one of the lines for some of the one piece of the running rigging. So just this slide was interesting because the Egyptian carried spare top yards in her channels. And that's what you can see here. You can't see my pointer here, but what you've got strapped to the mid and the mid and aft channels are two top yards, one on each side, carried there, which I found rather interesting. It may be usual elsewhere, but I haven't seen a lot of that in the French Navy. So I'm back to the triple block, and I wanted to talk very quickly, as we're running out of time here, about how I make these things. To me, the key to the game in this, the method is the same as even in larger scales, which is drilling two holes, connecting the two for a sheave for a single block, and then obviously more for a multiple block. In order to get the precision that you need, particularly in small ones, I first set up a T setup here so that I have a consistency. And then I take a piece of metal screening, and I'll come to that in a second, which has very precisely, I assume it's done with laser, but who knows, precise holes. And for this one, I happen to ink it out so it would make it easier to see, because it's often hard to see. And then lay a piece of boxwood down against the T and use a point, a pin chucked in a handle again, to poke at the holes. Here's some of the screen that I have saved over the years and used from time to time for different purposes. Anywhere that precision is required, this is a very good way of doing it, in my view, better than using a ruler or any other marker, because again, you can get consistency in two directions, which is important for multiple sheave blocks. So these were saved from, I don't know, I've had them for 20 years, bits and pieces. So having used them to mark, these are the marked holes, and then using the same drill bit that I showed you earlier, I would drill these and then connect them. Here, I've mentioned this in the past. I take a number 11 blade and grind down the point into a chisel. And the virtue of that for very small scale is that the point of a number 11 blade goes from essentially zero to about 2/100ths. I don't know. I haven't checked lately. But so you can pick a point along it for the width that you want. And in this case, very close to the point, I think 0010. And so then you've got the sheave, you have to do it on the other side as well. And then if the sheave is going to be deeper into the block, as some are, they vary enormously. It's easy enough to use the chisel to cut down a little further. These ones were fairly close to the surface. You can, you can buy decent quality blocks, particularly in the larger scales. Siren, I know, makes some. I find that making your own is enjoyable, actually, once you get into the system and making them. And I think it produces generally a better quality product than you can buy commercially. Some people would disagree, but this is the way I like to go. We end up again with this one, which is mounted on the mid channel, and again allows me to, should I want to, and I'm not going to in this particular model, run lines through it. So that is the end.